है ना? अरे तो ये चालू है तो इसका और भी आगे जाता है।
नहीं इसकी जरूरत है, इसे आगे रखेगा।
और उसको कोई
आएगा इनका।
काम करते हैं। एक लाके ऑन करके यहाँ रखना है। यहाँ रखो तो वहाँ नहीं बोलना। अतुल स्पीकिंग और यहाँ भी थोड़ा तुमको लगता है आगे इसको ऑन कर दो। अभी तो चलता है इससे करते होता है। इधर प्रोग्राम पता नहीं कहाँ रखा मैंने इसको प्रोग्राम में
अच्छा ओके आई जस्ट
So I think very this has started and now we are been very good. I'm glad because I have not been I never missed a lecture. Last week was this pandemic and also. So I said let me thank you. So must make it.
so kind.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Hi, how are you? Good to see you. आज नहीं जा रहे हो?
आपके पास लखनऊ
अच्छा अच्छा क्या क्या आगे मत पढ़िएगा दो पैर नहीं नहीं मैं खुद ही वहाँ कर लूँगा बहुत ज्यादा नहीं वो नहीं पढ़ता मैं इतना थैंक यू सर please settle down.
你是天学的 VCM 吗？连续的吗
？VCM 跟连续是一样。
哦，那确实吧。
English 是一样。
Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, our esteemed panelists, distinguished audience, those who are physically present here, and those who are digitally connected with us. Welcome to the United Service Institution of India. We are doing this event on a very contemporary subject together with fair observers. The CEO, Mr. Atul is here, and also with NICE Nepal, which is a new and a very energetic think tank. I'm very happy that we have a very distinguished panel from India and abroad. Unfortunately, due to COVID, our panelists from Russia and China, they've not been able to join us. So we'll have to do with panelists from US, panelists say from Sri Lanka. Now, this session is going to be chaired by Ambassador Arun K Singh, who has been our ambassador to US, France, Israel, and he is taken to teaching in a very big way. He has been teaching at Ashoka University and is associated with very prestigious universities and think tanks, including George Marshall Fund in US. Then we have Mr. Atul Singh, who is on to my left, and he's the founder and CEO of Fair Observer, which is a very, very analytical think tank. They have about 2,500 contributors from 93 countries. He's a multifaceted personality, educated in India, abroad, has a lot of operational experience as a police officer, and also taught at the University of California. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Ganeshan Vignaraja. He is from Sri Lanka. He's non-resident senior fellow at Institute of South Asian Studies in Singapore, member of Scientific Advisory Committee, the Geopolitical Cartographer, a very new think tank under the leadership of the former Prime Minister of Sri Lanka. He's been Director Research at Asia Development Bank and a visiting fellow at International Monetary Fund. He's a DPhil in economics from Oxford University and has about 20 books to his credit. Now, coming on to the topic of the day, this topic is very familiar, but just to put things in perspective before we have expert views on the subject, we know that the Cold War altered the geopolitical map of the world. And after the fragmentation of Soviet Union, there was a unipolar moment in which United States of America resorted to preemption and what you call is either you are with us or you are against us kind of a mindset. And at that time, they had made certain pledges that there would not be any extension of NATO, to the extent even Russians were looking forward to joining NATO and be part of a overall European security alliance system. At that time, when the NATO expansion started towards Eurasia, George Kennan, in an interview, was prescient when he said that this is the beginning of the new Cold War. That means the expansion of NATO eastwards. Now, that definitely has impacted Russia's self-image and its national security concern, and then came put into the center stage, and you know his leadership styles and things like that. So Russia has taken a certain strategic trajectory, which is for all of us to see. In the meanwhile, another very important event happened, and that was 9/11. And there, United States of America was again nudged to look towards different alliance and partnership, and that is how that global war on terrorism started. But concurrently, a fundamental assumption of US on China, that they will become an international stakeholder under a US-led international order, that assumption proved to be wrong. And Chinese, because of being an old civilization, it had a mind of its own, and it started asserting for a strategic influence in the Indo-Pacific. It wanted to be accommodated in the new world order. And from there, the contestation started. While US started, pivoting to Indo-Pacific, there was a strategic alignment between Russian, and Chinese in Eurasia, and post withdrawal of US, I think both the countries hold a total sway in the Eurasian landmass. In the Indo-Pacific, things are in a state of flux. While the NATO is being reinvented and re-energized, there are some amends being made to Euro-Atlantic Alliance. Still, there are question marks about the efficacy of the US East Asia Security Alliance system. All these things are in a state of flux. And post COVID-19 pandemic, rather than the world collaborating, some of these contradictions have got further compounded, we know. And as we stand today, there is a contestation over the ideology, strategic locations, resources, trade, technology, and influence in the global institutions. That is where different players are vying for influence. And in the meanwhile, the middle level powers and the smaller powers, they are aligning and realigning their positions depending upon their geopolitical interests. So at the center of this whole Cold War, new Cold War, you have the two protagonists, that is US and China, and there are other strategic alignments which are taking shape. And in this milieu, the role of middle level powers like India, Australia, Indonesia, South Korea, Japan becomes very, very important. The way the whole geopolitical scenario is panning out, it is causing a lot of dilemmas for India. We have to make certain strategic choices. Now, what those choices are going to be, are going to discuss. In the meanwhile, there are flashpoints which can trigger a conflict. What is happening in Ukraine now, a recognition of this eastern Ukraine by Russia and the economic sanctions by European Union and US. We don't know how this is going to pan out. Second flashpoint is, of course, Taiwan, where Chinese are resorting to strategic coercion. They're upping the ante there. And then there are unpredictable players like North Korea and all, who from time to time, keep flexing their nuclear muscles. And you have some issues in East China Sea. So therefore, the whole strategic scenario is in a state of flux. How this is likely to pan out, whether this Cold War is something what happened in the past, or is there some new dimension to this, we are going to discuss this subject. And to speak on the subject, first I'll hand over to Ambassador Arun K Singh to make his introductory remarks and then conduct the discussion. And then perhaps he may like to hand over to the keynote speaker, that is Atul K Singh. Ambassador Arun, over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, General Sharma, for this opportunity and for making such a comprehensive introduction. Perhaps we could not have timed this discussion better given some of the developments over the last few days. Russia has made a very important move from its perspective. It has recognized two erstwhile provinces of Ukraine as independent states. It has said it is sending its troops there as peacekeepers. The US has described the entry of Russian troops as an invasion. So they have to look at it now from their perspective and how they would need to respond to that. This particular move sets in process potential for subsequent moves because the territory that Russia has recognized as independent is beyond what Russia-supported forces control at the moment. So how will they and Russia deal with the other parts of Luhansk and Donetsk republics? And what would be their move related to that? I think the comments of President Putin have also indicated that potentially he feels that Russia is entitled to make an intervention also in the rest of Ukraine. And he has been talking about the history of Russia-Ukraine relations for some time now, and he even wrote a 5,000-word article in July last year. Now, if that happens, And you've seen that Russian forces have said that their stay in Belarus would be extended. And if there is going to be a presence of Russian forces potentially in Ukraine, you will have Russian forces bordering NATO presence, not just in Estonia and Latvia as of now, but also in Lithuania, in Poland, in Hungary, in Romania, and getting closer to the Russian presence in Moldova. So there will be potentially a significant confrontation presence between Russia on the one hand and NATO on the other. I think through this move, Russia has also signaled that it wants to be treated as a great power in the international context, and that the world is not only to be led by US and China in terms of a great power profile. You may recall that way back in 2012, when the then US presidential candidate Mitt Romney had said that Russia was the greatest threat to the United States. And President Obama had countered that Russia was a regional power and was not capable of challenging US in a global context. And I think Russia is asserting that it is also a global power. And therefore, the consequence from that is that we've found that the major powers tends to set their own rules in the international context. US has done that in the past. It did that when it intervened in Yugoslavia to break up that entity. It did that when it intervened in Serbia to create Kosovo from its perspective as an independent state, which is recognized only by a limited number of countries. And then it did that in Iraq in 2003. When it intervened to bring about regime change in Iraq. So with this struggle taking place, and if there is no understanding among the major powers, and you spoke potentially of what could happen in Taiwan and perhaps also in the context of South China Sea, East China Sea, we are seeing the challenge along the line of actual control with China, that there could be potentially increasing adversarial orientations between the major powers. And in this context, the joint statement that was issued by Russia and China on February 4th, when President Putin had visited for the inaugural of the Winter Olympics, talked about there being more limits to their partnership. They spoke about opposing NATO expansion. They spoke about any country not trying to enhance its security at the expense of others. They spoke against interference in internal affairs, spoke against about opposition to the color revolutions. So in many ways, positioning themselves clearly as opposed to what the US and the West have been trying to do it's in the various contexts. Interestingly, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, speaking at the Munich Security Conference a couple of days ago, while reiterating many of these positions in response to a question, and that was a bit overplayed also in the Western media, said that China supports sovereignty and territorial integrity, and that Ukraine was no exception to this, and that was seen as the distancing a bit from the Russian position. But when the debate took place yesterday in the UN Security Council after Russia's move, the Chinese permanent representative to the UN did not speak about sovereignty, territorial integrity. He said that China decides each issue on its own merits. The situation around Ukraine was complex, and then, of course, called for diplomacy to find a way out. So we have to factor in that in this scenario that is playing out, there is a certain amount of Chinese support for Russia and reciprocal support also for Chinese interests in the context of the Asia Pacific or the Indo Pacific. In response to that, I think we are seeing strengthening of coordination between US and Europe. the transatlantic alliance. We can expect strengthening of commitments to NATO. The US is already saying that it is going to send more troops. There's an expectation that the US Congress could, in the annual defense budget, give more provision for support to enhancing NATO presence in Europe. We'll have to see what happens about the new agenda, the Agenda 2030 that NATO was talking about, where they talked about earlier NATO potentially also playing a role in the Asia Pacific. And therefore, if China and Russia are seen as coordinating, then the Russian challenge to NATO and the transatlantic alliance in Europe will be seen as also being supported in some way by China. And how does NATO respond to that? Because in any case, the Chinese challenge to the West, to US, to Europe is not just in the Pacific. China has reached through the Belt and Road Initiative port buying out ports, dominating ports into Europe, and there are train and other connectivity happening there. So I think clearly we are going to be in a situation where the great powers will try to define narratives which they can sell to their own people and try and gain a wider international acceptance. They will try and back up that narrative with the power that their opponents will try to construct alternative narratives and try to generate support on that. And there's bound to be competition around that. And I think the challenge for India would be, some have said that India should stay away from this great power game. We had the policy of non-alignment earlier. We now talk of strategic autonomy. But even while not supporting one or the other power, my sense is that India will have to play its own game. But you'll have to play the game, because in the earlier context, in the bipolar context, while India had defined its policy of non-alignment, because of the way the US approached the whole concept of non-alignment, India ended up getting distance from the US, and US supported Pakistan, which became part of its military alliance. And over time, India was seen as being closer because of the support India has received in its relationship with the Soviet Union, with military and other support that was happening. And even in India, the opposition, when it came to power, started talking of genuine non-alignment. So I think India will have to play this game very carefully to try and make sure and because India has stakes in both of the sides here. Russia is a very strong defense partner. It has provided political support to India at critical times. And if we otherwise look at comprehensive national interests, US is the largest trading partner, largest investment partner, largest single country presence of Indian or even diaspora, largest single country presence of Indian students studying in universities. So it's a challenge that India will have to navigate. So given all this, I look forward to the discussions to hear from experts on their perspectives on how they see this competition playing out, how the various powers may manage it. Is it likely to intensify, or is there a way of dealing with all this within a certain defined parameters, so that the disruption to the international system is minimized? So with these initial comments, let me hand it over to Atul Singh to take forward the discussion.
Atulji.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Ambassador Arun. Thank you very much for those very informative and very, very insightful remarks. Yes.
All right. Thank you, Ambassador Singh. Thank you, General Sharma. It is a real honor to be here. My parents are sitting in the first row, and my Singaporean friends are also sitting in the first row, so no pressure. And my brother, of course, was the better debater. Both of us debated for Oxford, and he was the better debater. So he's here as well. So clearly, no pressure today. Anyway, I'm supposed to speak about, is the new Cold War a myth or a reality? And as I was taught at Oxford, try to break any topic down into 3 questions or 3 points. So what are the 3 questions for today? Number 1, what is or what was the Cold War? Then the second question, what is the new Cold War? And then the third question, which is really the topic, we get into the heat of, we get into the meat of it. I apologize for the vegetarians. The steak and bones analogy may work very well with Christopher, who's sitting in Washington and is a Texan, but may offend some sensibilities. But the meat of the matter is really, is it a myth or is it reality? Is the new Cold War? Is it just a souped up media jargon, or is it something which is real and tangible and substantive and has major implications for the future? Now, question one, what was the Cold War? Very simply, the Cold War was competition between the US and the Soviet Union. And this competition began almost immediately after the end of World War II, when they were both allies. And of course, it was a marriage of convenience. There was very little in common between the Soviet Union and Great Britain, or for that matter, the United States. But they all teamed up because Nazi Germany was a clear and present danger. It had invaded all sorts of countries. And at the end of World War II, the old rivalries resurfaced as the British Empire collapsed and American influence spread worldwide and the dollar became the reserve currency of the world. The Soviet Union was the only counterpart to American power. And this Cold War that began 1945-47 lasted until 1989-91. And we have Armenians here who have some experience of that period, who speak Russian, and they would add a very welcome addition to the discussion. Welcome, gentlemen. Now, this competition was military, it was geopolitical, and it was ideological. Military, I don't need to tell you about the nuclear scare that went around that time. For decades, American school children did drills. What would they do in case of a nuclear attack? I'm sure the Russians did that too. There was, of course, geopolitical competition all the way from Latin America to South Africa and indeed the African continent and to Asia. In 1953, America conducted a coup against a democratically elected Iranian president because of fear that he might be communist or he might be a socialist. So there's real fear. And that fear led to American adventures and misadventures. 1953 in Iran, a case in point, trying to prop up a failing and flailing French regime in Vietnam, another. I could go on till tomorrow, but you get the point. Similarly, the Soviet Union in 56 crushed the Hungarian uprising. Then in 68, it was the Prague Spring. So both sides played cat and mouse with each other. Both sides were competing for dominance in different theaters. The Cuban Missile Crisis is perhaps the most spectacular incident of that time, when, of course, the Soviet Union started stationing missiles not too far off Florida. And at its essence, this was a rivalry about global domination. There were two universalist powers battling for global supremacy with nuclear arsenals deployed at each other. Both of them had parallel universes. They weren't really trading much with each other. Both of them believed that their economic system, their political system was the final state for humanity. And in fact, when the Berlin Wall falls in 1989, and when the Soviet Union itself implodes in 1991, Francis Fukuyama in 1992 writes about the end of history. Now, as we know, history never ends, at least for those of us from the old world. Anyway, so much so for what was the Cold War. Let's get on to what is the new Cold War. Now, there's a chap in Chicago. We have somebody from Chicago here. He would be pleased to hear that. Russell Stamitz is here. Welcome, Russell. There's a chap from Chicago. His name is Professor John Mearsheimer. Now, those of us who've had to do our staff colleges, as some people have, and go to fancy universities and get fancy degrees, have to study these big names. And Mearsheimer is a jolly good chap. He's actually quite a decent lecturer. And he's also a provocative writer. And Mearsheimer argues that a new Cold War has broken out between China and the US. Now, what does he mean? What does this sage from Chicago mean by this term, the new Cold War? Well, he argues that an intense security competition that touches on every dimension of the US-China relationship has emerged, has broken out. And again, I'll try to break it down into three neat categories. After all, as they say, structure is the foundation of all knowledge, or the organization of knowledge, a matter for another debate. But the three realms are military, economic, and technological. Now, military, well, the US has 800 bases around the world. The US has fought a number of wars around the world. The US has the ability to project force around the world. It has logistical support for operations anywhere. It has a nuclear arsenal, of course, but it also has delivery mechanisms in terms of missiles, fantastic technologically cutting-edge planes, and of course, a fleet that patrols the seas and brings what many would say a global public good. The global security is guaranteed by the American military. And some would say China is starting to challenge it, at least in its near neighborhood. China is increasing its military budget. China is building up its navy. China is flexing its muscles and claiming little pieces of islands and flying planes in record numbers over Taiwan. And perhaps most worryingly, the Russians and the Chinese sailed their fleet around Honshu, the main island of Japan, which might be considered slightly provocative. It might be analogous to someone with a pistol walking up and down outside your door. Now, some would be very comfortable with it. Maybe Christopher, he'd step out for a gunfight. He's Texan after all. But shall we say a nice vegetarian Jain, as Russell's wife happens to be, may not be too pleased with somebody with a pistol outside her door. So that was a touch provocative, and it might be fair to say that a limited military competition is certainly emerging. It is certainly on the cards, and in its near neighborhood, China, emulating Russia, is following a policy of asymmetric warfare, meaning, all right, yes, you control the seas, but we can send a lot of cheap rockets over and sink some of your ships. We can do other stuff which will cost pretty less, but will cause a lot of damage. It is the workshop of the world. It can churn out lots of things at high speed. And yes, it may be blitzed in a high intensity, full-scale war, but it may have some cards up its sleeve in its near neighborhood. So a certain military competition has broken out, and an assertiveness under Xi Jinping is certainly clear. Let's look at the economics. I checked the Office of the US Trade Representative's website just before I started speaking, because I wanted the latest figures. In 2020, the GDP of China was $14.9 trillion. In 2020, the US GDP was estimated at, say, $20.9 trillion. These figures may be a bit here and there, but let's round them up to 15 and 21. $15 trillion for China, $21 trillion for the US. Obviously, in per capita terms, the US is a far wealthier country. But China has a GDP which certainly is not to be sneezed at, which means there are only two things really that determine a country's military power. One is, does it have the economy to support war? And two, does it have the will to fight? And China seems to have the economy, certainly today, to fight a war, to have a bish, bash, bosh. Does it have the will to fight? We don't know yet. Lots of single children, and as we know, single children don't really do very well in a punch-up, as we discovered not too long ago on our own borders. So we'll see whether they have the will to fight. They certainly have followed a wolf warrior diplomacy. So we don't know. If it's all bark and no bite. We will find out. But now let's get to US-China trade, because the key thing we're talking about right now in the economic argument is whether economically these two sides are pitted against each other in two parallel universes, challenging each other that their system is better than the other, as the Soviet Union and the US did, or there's something more going on. Well, 2020, the US-China trade amounted to $615.2 billion, of which US exports were $164.9 billion and imports were $450.4 billion. You can do the mathematics. US is still running a trade deficit against China, despite the trade wars of Donald Trump, despite all the bluster of Washington about containing China. It seems to be in an abusive relationship with China and can't get out of it, at least economically. So trade between the two countries is extremely interwoven. And the damage, well, of course, China would suffer tremendously. The damage to China would be catastrophic if all-out trade war breaks out, or if there's all-out war, as in World War II. But the damage to the US would also be considerable. And the US economy is overextended. It is deep in debt. It has structural issues, rising inequality. Lots of people have fallen out of the job market and they are not counted in the unemployment numbers. Lots of regions are under stress. A few industries have emerged and a few companies have emerged in a winners-take-all model. So if there is a trade war, a number of Americans are going to suffer, and they will suddenly have to pay a far higher price for cheap household goods. So inflation would go up dramatically. Already, tension with Russia is pushing inflation figures up, and that's a big challenge all across the world. But in the US, stimulus, and Christopher can speak more about it. He was on Capitol Hill. He ran for Congress last year. And Christopher can talk more about the internal economic constraints of the US right now. Such a trade war would be extremely expensive. And in America, politicians like Christopher, if they get elected to Congress, are facing election every 2 years. So the question is, can America take the pain? Can America get into a punch-up? The American military certainly can, but if there's a full punch-up, the economic costs to China would be catastrophic, but to America won't be negligible either. So economically, it is a bit of an abusive relationship actually for both parties, because China does not want dependence on the US either, which is why Xi Jinping has been trying to turn around the economy, which is why he's betting big on high-tech sectors. He's trying to stimulate domestic consumption. He's trying his best in an imperfect way to rein in the real estate speculation without crashing the economy. So China is trying to restructure itself from an export-based economy, an export-oriented economy, into an economy with more domestic consumption. Now, just so that you have an idea of the scale of dependence that China has on imports, back in the day in '79, if I remember correctly, and here please forgive me because I may be off by a bit, I've written about it, but suddenly I forgot to write down in my notes what was the percentage of exports in '79. I believe it was 4.5%. My Singaporean friends are extremely rigorous. They can correct me if I'm wrong. And I think at some point in the '90s, it had reached over 30%. Now, the moment your economy has over 30% of exports, you're extremely vulnerable to any shock. Add to that dimension the fact that China relies on outside sources for energy. China does not have its own oil. China does not have its own gas. As in World War II, it is extremely vulnerable like like Japan and Germany to anyone cutting off energy supplies? Why was Hitler making a dash both for the Caucasus and for North Africa at the same time, which was a ridiculous blunder? But the reason he was doing this was because he knew German tanks would stop rolling if they didn't have access to oil. And China knows it doesn't have access to energy. The Straits of Malacca can be cut off. The pipelines that they've built under the Belt and Road Initiative across Central Asia can be blown to smithereens. Ipso facto, of course, the cancellation of Nord Stream 2, and the ambassador was right. The ambassador was bang on the money when he said we couldn't have chosen a better time to have this discussion, because at a time when Nord Stream 2 has been cancelled, Putin has no option but to jump in bed with Xi Jinping. Vladimir Putin now is going to be very much in the pocket of Xi Jinping, because now Russia's oil and gas exports are all dependent on one market. So for now, despite their competition in Central Asia, despite their boundary disputes, the Chinese and the Russians seem to be coming closer, just as Austria, Hungary, and Germany came closer together before World War I. But I'll get to that in a minute. That's something that has been preying on my mind, actually, for weeks and months. I've discussed this with many people in the audience, friends and colleagues who are here, and with people who are offline. But the reality is that we are seeing a very complicated global economy with interdependencies, and the untangling of which would be painful, if not, and certainly difficult. Now, the third dimension of the new Cold War is technological. And when it comes to technology, we know that there is an American-led universe where the likes of Google and Facebook and Microsoft and Apple and Netflix and, of course, Twitter dominate, and Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, Meta now. These are the big giants of global data, of global information. If the Americans want to know about anyone, of course, it's the American companies. They can have the back key to anyone, and it's fantastic. Data is the new oil, as The Economist once said. And one universe is, again, akin to the United Nations, but unlike the United Nations, privately led, extremely efficient, extremely cutthroat Silicon Valley companies having global domination, and by that implication, upholding American power and the idea of a rules-based international global system, which of course was inaugurated after 1945 by the US, Bretton Woods being part of it, the whole edifice, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and the United Nations, all being part of that construct. And China, on the other hand, says, hang on a minute, we don't need Google. We don't need Facebook. We've got WeChat and TikTok and Alibaba and Baidu, and thank you very much. We'll have a great firewall of China. And we are going to start betting big on the technology which you've mastered. And we are going to have a separate system. And whilst doing so, we are going to steal industrial and scientific secrets from around the world. The number of cases, prosecution cases, that the FBI has brought in for espionage is at a record high. I believe the number, as Glenn Carl, my co-author who retired from the CIA, said, was something like 400. Again, apologies if I don't have the exact figure. I'll have to dig that out. We can dig that out later. But the key thing there is that these are notoriously hard cases to bring into court, which means that China is sending thousands of scholars around the world to come back with technological expertise to kickstart high-tech, cutting-edge projects. And there, certainly, even David Petraeus, General David Petraeus, who retired as the CIA director, who was interviewed with me, the interview is on YouTube, talked about we are in the foothills of a new technological Cold War. So the final question, and this is the last question, and after that other speakers can take the floor, is the new Cold War a myth or a reality? And as the French would say, it's complicated, you know? With the French, everything is complicated, isn't it? We don't have French people in the audience today, so I can have them as a scapegoat, serves them right. But the key thing here is that, look, the US and China were tacit allies during the last half of the last Cold War. The CCP basically shifted from the Soviet Union to the US. Of course, we know that Mao didn't particularly like what he saw the big brother attitude of the Soviet Union. We know how Henry Kissinger went to China and then Richard Nixon followed. We know that once Mao died and Deng took over in 1978, he said remarkably that it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. We know that none other than the great Lee Kuan Yew, the visionary leader of Singapore, said that Deng was the most impressive leader in the 20th century that he'd encountered. And he said because he had the ability to change his mind, which is the most difficult thing for any leader to do. And Deng's 1978 revolution, and after that he bet big in 1992 with Nixon. He went on a southern tour and he said, we are going to go full throttle into the markets. Remember, 1992 was a worrying time. Why? Because 1989, the Berlin Wall falls and the Tiananmen Square protests erupt, which are crushed, brutally crushed. 1991, the Soviet Union falls. There is internal debate in the CCP. Should we close shop? Should we hunker in? Should we get into our bunkers? Or should we double down? And Deng says, double down. Like James Bond on a casino table, he throws in all his chips. And guess what? 1992 onwards, China grows. And of course, Mearsheimer says this policy of engagement in the hope that China would become a part of the liberal world order was the biggest strategic blunder the US has ever made. Because Mearsheimer is a realist and he blames those who believed in the universality of the liberal order for being stupid about it. Because powers clash. Big powers are like big boys. They have a bit of a punch up, a bit of a dust up. And Mearsheimer says, of course, the clash was inevitable. But in the heady days after the Berlin Wall fell, there was a genuine belief that it was the end of history. Clinton was an inexperienced president, wasn't a particularly sophisticated foreign policy operator. And China basically grew. And 2001, everyone thinks of 9/11. Oh, and I have gone to a number of young diplomats and trained them, and particularly in Asia. I say, okay, why was 2000, South Asia particularly, if you ask them why was 2001 important, they all answer 9/11, the attacks in New York and Washington. But 2001 was also the year China entered the WTO, as those in East Asia know very well. So America got distracted for 20 years in Afghanistan, in the deserts of Iraq, whilst China put its foot on the accelerator and said, thank you very much, we'll grow. And of course, until Xi Jinping came along, China followed Deng Xiaoping's maxim, which was bide your time, hide your strength. And they did it very cleverly. They understood that they were vulnerable at the Straits of Malacca. They understood that, yes, they were growing, but their per capita income was low. They understood that their military had no combat experience since 1979, when they went head-to-head with the Vietnamese and ended up with a bloody nose. So the Chinese understood that, but with Xi, the progressive liberalization, even of society, the increasing ease that you had of doing business basically went down. And now the CCP has transformed Marxism into consumer capitalism, whilst at the same time choking personal liberties. There's no hint of democracy. Xi is cutting off access to the outside world. He's defying the US-based international legal norms. He's encouraging a very shrill frankly immature. Wolf warrior diplomacy reminds me of Kaiser Wilhelm before World War I. He's also enforcing orthodoxy, whitewashing history, and oppressing minorities. He's now the head of his nation for life. At the same time, the US, to use the words of another academic, his name is slipping my mind, the US is suffering from Brezhnev-like paralysis. The US democracy has always been fractious, turbulent, and messy. Those of us who grew up in India understand that. We come from a similar country. But the challenge that has happened is that the US now has a lack of strategic vision, and different parties are too busy fighting each other than operating with some semblance of sanity. Now, some could say that the US has always been fractious. Punctuated equilibrium is the natural state of affairs. This academic has said it. And of course, China has decades of stability punctuated by protracted upheavals when authority fails. And the examples are, and I'll quickly wrap up, the Taiping Rebellion of 1850 to 1864 took 20 million lives, 5% of China's population, which even at that time was a very densely populated country. And you could argue that it took until 1949 for China to stabilize. It's only when the CCP led by Mao takes over that China stabilizes. In contrast, the American Civil War, which lasts from 1861 to 1865, killed 750,000 combatants, 2.5% of the population of a much less crowded country, and America was back on its feet pretty quickly. And so you could argue America is more resilient, and China has internal contradictions and external enemies. Having said that, the key thing here is that the die is cast for great power rivalry again. The Thucydides trap that a certain professor at Harvard has talked about is back in play. Whether a ruling power and a rising power can coexist remains to be seen. We have seen what decades of hurt, and I've written a very long article with Glenn Carl, a retired CIA officer, about Vladimir Putin's long game. I encourage all of you to read it. So I don't want to talk about Russia. I spent yesterday talking in television studios about Russia. But today, the focus is China. But what Vladimir Putin has demonstrated, that if there is hurt, if there is anger, things can erupt. And China certainly has hurt. There is a mythology of a century of humiliation at the hands of the white man. And of course, the US was one of the powers that participated in the humiliation of China. And the US, of course, has this belief that China is a malignant power. It is a communist country that doesn't allow liberty and democracy and threatens key allies such as Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and so on and so forth. So the die is cast to see how the Thucydides trap plays out. And we certainly are headed for a new Cold War. It may not appear because of the economic ties yet. And if leadership in Beijing and Washington acts unwisely, it could easily slip into a hot war too. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you very much. So back to Ambassador Arun. Is he there? Ambassador Arun? Ambassador Arun? Is he muted?
No. So, General Sharma, my understanding was that you would now conduct the proceedings and the conversation since I'm here virtually, and then I'll make concluding comments at the end.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much. So, my compliments to Mr. Atul for a very, very comprehensive and insightful perspective on the Cold War, whether it is a myth or a reality. And in his concluding remarks, I think he is very convincingly said that we are really into a real Cold War. It's no more a myth, and it could, if there are certain miscalculations, it could lead into a hot war kind of a situation. Our next speaker is Mr. Christopher, and I couldn't see him that time online. So now I have the privilege of knowing him through Atul and also introducing him. He's a very young, budding senator to be in the future. he, he is a policy advisor, and he has a tremendous experience at the Capitol Hill, working with 3 congressmen and also advising Pentagon a number of policy issues. And he ran for Congress in 2020 for a special election, and he intends running all over again in 2024. So may have your perspective. How are you looking at this Cold War, and particularly the recent developments that are taking place from your perspective, please? You have about 10 minutes. And
Yes,
then we'll
all right. Thank you, General.
Elaborate question answer session. Okay.
Okay. Well, I suppose in the wake of Atul's discussion, I have to go back to the no plan survives first contact. I had some remarks prepared, but we're going to deviate from that, so bear with me. I do maintain that we are in a new Cold War, though the contours of it are different from the last one, and frankly, few lessons apply to our current situation. However, I do think that the present Cold War need not be outwardly hostile. And I also think the past is not entirely devoid of prologue. So if we are in a new Cold War, how do we know that? Cold Wars don't have formal declarations. And so the question to some degree is a question of sentiment. And I'll go to a couple of studies briefly. Last year, a study by the European Council on Foreign Relations found that a third of Europeans believe the EU is in a Cold War with China. They had a lot of undecideds. Fully a third said they didn't know. But almost 2/3 believe the US is in a Cold War with China. And I'm starting off with China because that's sort of the new Cold War. Friction between the US and Russia has been there a long time. You may recall, was discussed earlier, Mitt Romney discussed Russia as a great geopolitical threat. The Wall Street Journal tomorrow will have an editorial that says the 80s got their foreign policy back, which is how President Obama responded. But the Europeans perceive America as decidedly being in a Cold War with China. That comports with a Pew study that was done early last year. And that found that Americans favor tougher stances toward China on issues ranging from human rights to economic concerns. And to confirm that, the same Pew report said that 67% of Americans have a quote unquote cold feeling toward China on what they called their feeling thermometer. So even accounting for maybe a moderation in those feelings, given the antipathy felt with COVID, I think it's still safe to say that the U.S. citizenry certainly perceives China as a threat and believes we are at the very least in a cold standoff. What is interesting to me is there is a disconnect in what I've seen in the last year between the populace and the politicians. America's legislative agenda has recently leveraged Sino-American apprehension to introduce and pass bills that are full of tangentially related items. So much of what we're passing, or at least discussing, is more or less spending on preferred voting blocks. For example, the House of Representatives has a bill they call the America Competes Act, and it's full of environmental messaging and labor giveaways and loan guarantees and extraneous measures. And this bill also effectively mimics Chinese centralization of industrial policy, much like the Build Back Better and the infrastructure bill we passed. So in short, the American people think we're in a Cold War, but for the legislators, we're in a golden age of pork. Now, I want to address that because Atul brought up an interesting point about spending ourselves into oblivion, which America is most certainly doing. He talked about the size of our economies. One interesting thing to note, by one measure, purchasing power parity, China is already a larger economy, or at least more affluent. This is a pork that we can ill afford. It also leads into that will to fight, but we have a lot of domestic concerns right now. When you look at what's called the U6 of employment, we have a tremendous number of people who could work, who aren't, who have decided not to look for a job for whatever reason. Some of those reasons have been attributed to easy money from the federal government, a lot of lenient policies perhaps. And we're also in the midst of inflation, where the cost of goods are going up and the labor participation rate is not where we would like it to be, particularly when you look at that U6. Domestic concerns predominate, and that is clear by the legislation that we're passing. It's also interesting the size of these bills. So back in the financial crisis, I was on Capitol Hill, and what we thought of as one of the most monstrous packages ever passed in terms of just sheer size was the $787 billion ARA, American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, also known as the stimulus. These were numbers that people thought were mind-boggling, Republican and Democrat alike. Then we fast forward to COVID, and we had $4 trillion spent under Trump, and we've had, a number of other trillions, $3 trillion in the last year spent by President Biden. 2 of that was for a COVID relief bill, and 1.1 of that was for an infrastructure bill. These are numbers that America can't sustain, and they especially can't sustain it in the face of rising treasury rates, a function of inflation. So this all plays into the will to fight, our preparedness, an erosion of the military's budget. And an interesting thing about that, we have yet to pass an NDAA, which is an annual sort of priority bill for the military. Yet the Pentagon released their climate change plan last week, I think it was. So do we have the will to fight? Do we have the means to fight? That's a question. I will say that in Middle America, the threat of China is real, from the factory worker who worries about his job being offshored to China to the CEO who worries about cyber espionage or intellectual property theft. There is a strong wariness of China. Markets that were once too big to ignore are increasingly thought of as too risky to join. But curiously, there is, as Atul mentioned, an interconnection with our economies that people can't fail to recognize. So this is not the Cold War of yesteryear. Not that long ago, Americans perceived Russia as the greater threat, but Trump kind of shifted that focus, and he did so with trade rhetoric, with asking NATO allies to pony up and meet their obligations. But what Trump did not do particularly well was cultivate strong relations with world leaders. Now, you contrast that with the current administration, which boasts stronger relationships and is perhaps more willing to use the resources of NATO and more willing to work with NATO. But this current administration has faced a dizzying number of setbacks, not least of which was the bungled withdrawal from Afghanistan. So Trump was a blunt instrument, but Biden has had a lot of poor execution. We've also had unforced errors that have left our allies confused and frustrated. The Trans-Pacific Partnership withdrawal under Trump was a concern and has left an avenue for China to potentially exploit. And America's promises are increasingly viewed as more whims than obligations. And so that concern seems justified. I mean, we are in an introspective moment where I think America is asking itself whether the old values upon which the country was built are still valid, whether or not they're worth fighting for. And that, that leads to a lot of navel gazing in stateside. But this is not just a Republican or Democrat thing. From Trump's America First program to the wokeism of Democrats, it's across the parties. Look no further than to this year when we spent all of our floor time on the House and the Senate talking about an expansion of the social welfare system in a voting rights bill. So I don't know that there's a lot of will to get involved. We pulled out of Afghanistan, and I don't think Americans especially want to get re-embroiled in something. Meanwhile, the Chinese are making focused, concrete moves that achieve immediate geopolitical ends, and I'm consistently amazed at the international concerns that permit China to pivot and sort of play the game. I think of COP26, where there was that last minute agreement with the US and America that kind of salvaged that, in my opinion, debacle. And they knew how to get brownie points for doing very little, making promises that were pie in the sky and they knew didn't amount to much. And they must absolutely marvel at that, while they also marvel at how America is just spending itself blind. I will say wolf warrior diplomacy appears to be a failure. Vaccine diplomacy is hollow. Mistrust is everywhere, and why not? I mean, from the building of the artificial islands that were promised they wouldn't militarize while they were putting up runways and radar. Hong Kong is a shadow of itself in contravention of the joint declaration. Taiwan feels threatened. Japan is intimidated. Atul referenced Honshu. To say nothing of those harassed at the 9, 10, or whatever it is, 11-dash line. So this is not how you win hearts and minds. The Quad and AUKUS are a direct response to this growing instability. And while the Quad is broader than the Security Pact of AUKUS, both are aimed at fostering greater agreement and providing a coordinated front in the face of greater global instability in a more assertive China. It's worth noting that the Australians were willing to sacrifice a little bit of their relationship with the French, and the Indians are also leery of the Chinese. Let's not forget, India was more closely aligned to perhaps the Soviet Union than us back during the Cold War I. And now they're looking for new partners. And one of those partners is America vis-a-vis the Quad. Skirmishes in past years have created growing apprehension in India, including the one skirmish where 20 Indian soldiers were killed. Interestingly, those skirmishes have been internationally reported and may seem small to a lot of people, but they get more press than you would think. I don't want to take more than my time, so perhaps I'll leave it at that. But it is a question of our willingness, our financial capability, and the sort of alliances that we're building. The hope being that in constructing these alliances, we will be able to spread out some of the weight of quote unquote policing the world. And I think that ideally will lead to greater stability. And I could go on, but I think I'll leave it there because I'm out of time.
I just have a follow-up question
Sure.
here. So you'd like to kindly elucidate. See, Putin has thrown the gauntlet now, and there were problems that you were facing in the Euro-Atlantic alliance in terms of Germany and France, going their own way and trying to cut certain deals with Russia. But now probably European Union has got consolidated. 27 countries plus Britain, they've all gone for a sleeve of economic sanctions against Russia. Now, at the same time, if Putin pushes the envelope further, there may be requirement of a military response, though you have already ordered some troops of NATO to be deployed. Is there some kind of a consensus developing in the American political leadership to have a holistic or kind of a unified approach to deal with this crisis? Or is it going to be a divided house as it's been in the past, compounded by a very high inflation rate that you're facing. So if you were at the helm of affairs, how would you deal with the crisis?
Sure. You opened up a whole bunch of cans of worms. First of all, I think Germany's being brought kicking and screaming to this consensus. Keep in mind, the UK had to fly supplies around Germany so that they wouldn't get rejected or embarrass Germany or create a problem. Germany killing or suggesting they might do something about Nord Stream 2, I think that might have been a response or at least an effort to prevent Biden from jumping in any more than they wanted him to. Now, will the U.S. supply soldiers? Certainly not in a direct conflict in Ukraine. There is very little appetite for that. However, would the U.S. contemplate, and is Biden contemplating, armament of some kind, call it a Lend-Lease deal? I don't care. Are they contemplating that? They very well might be. And there was an effort, as you recall, somewhat staunched by the Germans to provide supplies to the Ukrainians. The German contribution, as you might know, was 5,000 helmets. Thank you very much. But I think there would be a willingness to arm the Ukrainians to some degree, but not in terms of personnel. An important note here is that the consensus is a little bit fractured. It falls down unusual lines, with Republicans in some cases arguing that Ukraine isn't worth fighting for. There's a sort of Tucker Carlson phenomenon out there. He's a news anchor, where you do see some Republicans saying we shouldn't get involved with Ukraine. That's a break from past stances. But I think there might be the willingness to provide things to Ukraine, but it will be held at an arm's length. And I also want to say that I thought Biden, in coordination with the UK and perhaps others, did a good job of preempting some of Putin's moves by saying he wants to install a puppet government. Here are the people he's looking at. He has actors lined up to stage a false incursion. That's the old Putin playbook. And I think to some degree they took away those options, at least in a way Putin would want to use them. So I'm not really a Biden basher on this subject. I think they did some novel things and some good things. But in terms of an appetite for putting US troops in Ukraine, I do not see that, nor would I expect that from this administration.
Thank you.
I have a follow-up question for you, Christopher. You worked in the Pentagon, and I certainly have friends in the Pentagon, and I suspect you do too, who argue that Russia is a distraction. We should make allowances for Russia's strategic considerations, its insecurities. After all, the US reacted very badly when there were missiles in Cuba, and Ukraine historically is home to the Kingdom of Rus. And so, there's no reason not to give an assurance to the Russians that, hey, we won't be standing at your doorstep. And the crux of this argument is seduce Russia away from China's arms, just as Kissinger seduced China away from Russia's arm. Use the Kissinger playbook, and then you have encircled China. What do you say to that?
I don't see where Putin would respond positively to American overtures. He views us as part of the problem. There might even be a degree of jealousy. As you rightly point out, there is this quasi-fictional history-ishness. And then there is a decided history, the Kingdom of Rus, that makes this more difficult to predict, because there is the strategic value of Ukraine. And then there is, what does it really mean to Putin? I hesitate I don't know what would be appealing enough to Putin for him to say, never mind, I'll forgo China and embrace America. Particularly since, as you noted, there is a natural shift. What does Russia produce? It's a petrostate. China has a large appetite for O&G, oil and gas. So in the wake of Germany putting the pause there, and keep in mind, Germany doesn't have a lot of options either. They did away with their nuclear. They have no means of receiving LNG. They burned they decided not to build the 2 LNG terminals that they were going to when Trump was threatening to put the kibosh on Nord Stream 2. And then the Netherlands is no longer producing from their large well. What would be appealing enough to Putin? From what I understand, we have suggested to Putin 6 ways to Sunday that we have no intention of bringing Ukraine in to NATO. I think it's fair to say that NATO partners have to decide that, but there's not been an appetite to have Ukraine for a long, long time. So aside from giving him the run of the country, how can we assure him there are not missiles there, that we do not intend to invade? What would be sufficient to entice him? And there aren't very many things that we haven't already offered. Now, contrary-wise, you can say, well, we say, never mind, we won't do sanctions, we won't do this, we won't do that, we'll let the banks open up to the oligarchs and your thugs. But then you also have a sort of lawlessness and a further emboldened Russia. Where do they go from there? So do they have designs on more of the CIS country, more of Eastern Europe? So I struggle to think of something that would be the lock for Putin to say, okay, I'm with you guys. I mean, you mentioned earlier the history of Russia, and Putin came about during the age of Afghanistan. So I think there's a very deeply entrenched mistrust or even distaste for America and anything it represents. Putin is, in my mind, not just a thug. He is, but he's not just that. And I think part of the reason why he's going into Ukraine is because he's driven by that passion, that history, that the greatest loss, the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century was the disintegration of the Soviet Union. This is integral with who he is. So I just don't think there's anything we can offer that he would say, never mind, I'm against China.
Yeah, you're right. He was posted in East Germany, and he called the local tank commander. And the local tank commander said, Moscow is silent. And that has haunted him since. So he's, of course, driven by that memory. He's named after Vladimir, the founder of the Kingdom of Rus, lest we forget. And he also remembers shock therapy with bitterness. He believes, as do many Russians when you talk to them, over vodka, of course, that America planned the collapse of the Russian economy, and then when Russia's economy was not on its knees, when it was on its back, then expanded NATO right to Russia's doorstep. So you're absolutely right. There is real resentment there.
So to that point, the question is, how much does Putin blame that NATO expansion on America? I mean, if you watch RTTV, everything is not a European plot. It's always an American plot, right? So let's just assume we did have something really good. How does he sell that to his people? And if they're told for decades that America is, just awful and responsible for so many of these ills, I don't think there is a way to get around that and to get around the deeply embittered history of Putin with regard to more America than just the West. And as I said earlier, it was America that caused the great Afghanistan debacle for the Soviet Union. And I'm sure he blames us for somehow thwarting Soviet greatness even then.
Thank you so much. We'll get you over again for the question answer session. And now our next speaker is Dr. Ganeshan Vignaraja from Sri Lanka. Is he there? Get him on.
Yes, can you hear me, Chair?
Yeah. So before you begin, and whatever perspective you want to present, I would just pose a few questions. Since you are a leading economist, I would also, after you've given your perspective, would like to educate us on the implications of these economic sanctions on Russia. What impact it will have on the European economic scenario, since the economies were interlinked, And to what an extent, if Russia stops all the gas supplies to Europe, to what an extent will United States of America be able to make up that loss, and at what cost? Because I saw some tweeters in the morning that the gas prices in Europe, particularly Eastern and Central Europe, are going to skyrocket, and these are not going to be affordable. So among other things, if you would like to comment on this economic war dimension of this Cold War. Over to you, Dr. Vignarajan.
Thank you very much, Chair. We'd like to thank the United Services Institution of India for this chance for the geopolitical cartographer to comment today. And as you kindly said in your remarks, we are a startup think tank, which is independently looking at the Indian Ocean. There's been a lot of talk about this Ukraine crisis, so I won't say anything right now, but I will come back to your question in a little while. I'm going to talk a little bit about some facts which weren't quite there in the origins of this Cold War that we talked about, the first Cold War, if you like. I'm going to then talk a little bit about Asia's rise and the economics underlying it. And last, I'm going to talk about the strategies of small powers in this kind of story of the big powers clashing amongst themselves. I'm very grateful to my colleague, Mrs. Vageswara, the former Foreign Secretary of Sri Lanka, for giving me some inputs for this talk. On the history side, I think the superpower part was emphasized, and the rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union. But I think what wasn't sufficiently emphasized was perhaps the fact that both the US and Russia offered different economic models. One was capitalism based on free trade and markets, and the other was basically socialism based on inward-oriented state domination. And I think this is very important when you look at what happened subsequently, and the spend question that our speaker from the US talked about the US having a difficulty in outspending China. And maybe this is a very important point. But anyway, for the other countries, this polarization of ideologies and military presence offered the choice of countries being allied, partners, or proxies to these great powers. What was also not really mentioned so much was the non-aligned movement, which was formed in the 1950s, that had many developing states which sought to advance economically within this very complex Cold War environment. And the non-aligned movement represents something like 120 states with 50% of the world's population. Now, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I think it was really the collapse of the economic model of the Soviet Union that really brought the end of the first stage of the Cold War. I mean, basically, Reagan, if I remember it right, challenged the Russians to military spending, and the Russians just couldn't do this, and their economy couldn't bear the weight of it. And I think that's very important to look at, bringing the point that Christopher talked about, the US now having to face this challenge of China spending more in today's context. And of course, we have the middle powers. The second thing briefly to comment on is the rise of Asia. Now, the emergence of factory Asia, mainly this kind of geographically dispersed system of production known as global value chains, with China increasingly at the center of this production network globally, and the US being the biggest consumer of the output of this network, has really led to the center of gravity of the world economy, or the economic center moving to Asia, and brought attention to this question of China and also India. Now, China, it's true that in purchasing power parity terms, China is probably wealthier than the US, but perhaps China's gap isn't evident to us elsewhere, but should be mentioned. China does not have the MITs and the Harvards and so on of this world. It doesn't have Silicon Valley raising capital. It doesn't have Wall Street. So China doesn't quite have the institutions that the United States has. Nonetheless, the US does feel threatened by China's advancement. And I understand that some of that is because China is building aircraft carriers. China is spending heavily on R&D, trying to consolidate its manufacturing presence. And the US, of course, has taken military steps and alliance steps to try to counter China's threat. The Quad was mentioned. China's approach has also brought the Biden administration, I think a few days ago, to announce a comprehensive, free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. And it would be very interesting to see if this is any different to what Trump has mentioned before. Is this an amendment? Are we in fact going to even see the US going into the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, or the CPTPP, which Trump left, of course? That would be very interesting. Now, of course, the Chinese model is the development model is capitalism with Chinese characteristics. And this is kind of predicated on an opportunistic state, a market economy coexisting with state-owned enterprises, a culturally self-sustained society, and a strong pragmatic tradition. China has amended this story, of course, today to talk about this dual circulation model, which means exports, but also domestic consumption and a domestic market, trying to reduce its interdependence on the US. Now, it is exporting its model to other countries through the Belt and Road investment and trade concessions. Some developing countries have seen benefits in ports and energy investments, but others risk this Chinese debt trap issue in the COVID era. Now, India is, of course, appearing to tilt towards the US as China's rise is an issue, mainly due to security factors. Under the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, the US, of course, envisages India to play a role as a net security provider for at least South Asia, but perhaps a wider plank in the Indo-Pacific. But India seems cautious on taking this position and sort of a very strong pro-US stance, as its kind of values and principles, including non-alignment, differ from a completely pro-Western view. But I think this is in kind of flux. The last thing I want to briefly mention is really about small powers in this kind of world. The old African proverb, when the elephants fight, the grass gets trampled, is very true, perhaps today, in terms of the impact of great power rivalries on small countries. Now, a rules-based international system, which treats big and small powers alike, offers the best prospects for small developing countries in Asia, and including those in South Asia. But multilateralism is eroding for various reasons, also in the face of great power rivalries. Small powers need to really advocate as best as possible for strengthening the rules-based multilateral system under the IMF, the World Trading Organization, and the UN, amongst other important institutions. And diplomacy is clearly much, much better than the idea of the hot war, than the world sliding from a Cold War into a hot war. As a complementary strategy, the small powers should really focus on economic development through outward-oriented strategies and attempt to maintain neutrality in the face of great power rivalries. And there may indeed be some opportunities for small powers to gain by getting foreign aid and trade concessions. And you have some interesting examples of this from Singapore to New Zealand and Chile as examples of countries that have managed to sort of benefit in this world of great power rivalries. So in kind of conclusion, is there really a new Cold War, or are we really in a state of transition and flux? And will there be a kind of a hot war from this Cold War sliding into a state of unexpected conflict from miscalculations? It remains to be seen. Small powers need to maneuver very smartly in this era by talking about multilateralism and outward-oriented strategies and neutrality. Now, let me just try briefly to respond to the question that was posed to me about the economic impact of Russia's incursion into Ukraine and what it means for Europe. For sure, Europe is energy dependent on the Soviet Union. The movement towards renewables has not taken place in the way that Europe would want to, although it's attempting to do this, and it's also looking to resource other sources of energy. Now, if Russia stops all the gas, for sure Europe's growth will plummet, and the cost of electricity has skyrocketed. Now, whether this is 1 percentage point of Europe's growth or 2 percentage points remains to be seen. And of course, all of this comes against the backdrop of Europe projected to grow much faster than before and coming out of COVID. So this geopolitical conflict with its concomitant effects on energy security will have definitely large impacts. How much depends on the escalation, of course, and remains to be seen. And the US filling the gap, I don't see this in the short run, partly because the US itself has its own energy issues to worry about and also its own commitments. In the medium term, of course, switching of energy towards other players, including renewables, is possible, but this requires big infrastructure investment. So in the short run, I think there will be quite a big impact on Europe, which is, I think, why you're getting countries like Germany being quite cautious because they're one of those in the front lines of this energy issue. Thank you, Chair. Happy to address any questions that you might have.
Yeah, so the follow-up question is now, let's look at things from the other perspective that these very comprehensive economic sanctions which have been imposed by US and 27 countries of European Union plus the UK. Now, they've also said that they will not have any business with these two enclaves in Donbass region. They've also imposed sanctions on Duma and number of other functionaries and the financial institutions. What impact it is going to have as Russia's integration with the global or European economy? Will it hurt Russia more, or they have a bandwidth to absorb this and they would be further tilt towards China? And then what kind of a model they are looking at? If so the transactions don't take place in dollars, then what happens, or in any other currency?
So for sure, the sanctions will hurt the Russian economy quite a lot, because the Russian economy is fairly lopsided. I mean, there's a large military industrial complex, but the civilian manufacturing sector is very weak. It has been also undermined in a way by the Dutch disease problem due to the gas and oil sector that Russia has. And it doesn't really produce a competitive system. So Russia will suffer. I think the biggest issue that may be there, and I'm not sure if it's part of this sanction package, is if the SWIFT system is withdrawn, the system for making international payments. If this is also done, this will have a devastating impact on the Russian system, basically freezing them out of international banking transactions. Now all of that said, and Russia's economic prospects are bound to be more bleak because it also can't afford a long war, in Ukraine and elsewhere, because it just doesn't have the financial might to continue to do this. Now, China, Russia is an interesting story. China can certainly fill the void in acting as a provider of consumer goods and capital goods to Russia. And I think you're seeing increasing Russia-Chinese trade from a very low base taking place. Now, whether the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and other means of a Russia-China trade deal are there, we have to see, because China, while it naturally wants to support Russia in the context of this type of conflict it has with the United States, will also be wary of pushing or overplaying its hand, mainly because of the interdependence between China and the US. And that is quite significant. And I would argue that economic interdependence, as I mentioned, with Factory Asia, China being the world's factory, with parts and components coming from other parts of Asia, Japan, Korea, etc., but the final market being in the United States and Europe, really has brought a sobering reality in Beijing. And if China were to accelerate this dual circulation model with domestic consumption, over time, some dependence may be there, taken away, because Asia is the world's largest producer today, increasingly the world's largest consumer, increasingly the world's largest saver, particularly East Asia. But it's not decoupled from the US and the West, and I think that's a bit of a myth. So interdependence will be a check on China being overtly friendly towards Russia. I think China's interest relies much more on interdependence with the United States and Europe than perhaps its alliance with Russia. it's less dependent. So I think that's sort of my take. Hit on Russia from this crisis, it can't sustain it, and also China's calculation will be not to upset the apple cart too much by going into a full-blown conflict with the US at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very insightful and advanced perspective. Now we request Ambassador Arun is there. Arun K Singh. Ambassador Arun, would you like to say something at this juncture before I open the question answer session?
Sure. So I can make some comments, very brief comments based on what has been said so far. And I think, as you mentioned, very rich sort of discussion. So I was assigned in Moscow in the second half of the 1990s, when the first decision on NATO expansion to the east was worked out by the US and the West. And I could sense in Russia the deepening of the feeling that Russia was not seen anymore as a partner. And I think you referred also to the comments that George Kennan had made. And it was also at the same time that Russia and Ukraine had worked out the agreement between them on the Black Sea fleet. Because the Black Sea fleet, for I think Russia's strong presence in the area of the Black Sea, it was critical for Russia's projection of power. And that itself was again a very, very wrenching experience for Russia, because it also introduced an element of uncertainty related to how a future Ukraine would host elements of the Black Sea fleet. And so we saw that play out in 2014 with Russian moves in Crimea. And since then, of course, Russia has been trying to see what it can do in terms of dealing with NATO expansion. Now, we have to factor in that in the West, particularly in the US, there was a feeling that they had won the Cold War. And in fact, if you go back and look at the State of the Union address that President George H.W. Bush gave in January 1992, he said clearly, the Cold War is not over, we have won the Cold War. That was the sentiment. And at the time of President Clinton, when he was going in for his re-election, there were people of East European origin in the US, in some of the key states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and for whose votes President Clinton needed to support the expansion of NATO to the east, a demand that was being lobbied very heavily by East European countries, including Poland and the others. And therefore, they had a certain political compulsion also to allow or lead the NATO expansion to the east. So there is elements of geopolitics, geostrategy, but there is also elements of domestic compulsion on all sides that is playing out here. So, of course, at one level, the First Cold War was formulated in terms of difference in ideology, communism versus capitalism. But even in the current context, I think there is a projection being made that there is a struggle between democracy on the one hand and autocracy on the other. But of course, this is not a very perfect sort of formulation or categorization, because among many allies and partners of US and the West are countries that can't really be legitimately called effectively functioning democracy. But this is the argument that will be made going ahead as categorizations are done. I think there was a reference to the GDP of different countries, and from the figures that Atul mentioned, if you have 15 trillion for China, another 2 trillion for Russia, that's 17, and you have 21 trillion for the US, and another 20 trillion for the European Union and the UK. So you have about 17 trillion versus 40 trillion, and more than 50% of the global GDP is still generated by US and Europe, which will certainly be a factor. I think another dimension we are seeing is that in the immediate post-Cold War period, when it was a US preponderance, in the beginning, US used its dominant military power. And we saw that in Yugoslavia, Serbia, Iraq in 2003. But after that, when the US willed to use military power to enforce its preferred options started to wane, and therefore there was a ignoring of the red line in Syria, leading from behind in Libya, withdrawal from Afghanistan. The US started using more and more economic coercion and sanctions to try and achieve what it wanted. But there are limits to that. And I think as this progresses, we will find certainly that other countries, including Russia and China, will try and work out mechanisms to protect themselves from US economic sanctions coercion. That will be done even in the context of Iran, for example. There are reports of China helping Iran sort of evade some of the sanctions that the US has imposed by buying oil from Iran. Again, going ahead, I think one of the complicating factors would be, contrary to what we saw in the time of the First World War, the economic and other relations that are there between the US and Europe and on one side and Russia and China on the other. For example, on gas, Europe is dependent for 90% of its gas requirements based on imports, and 50% of that comes from Russia. Now, how do they handle that? And even within there, the dependence of Germany and Italy is much more than some of the other European countries. If you look at China, for example, Europe has been very reluctant to join US articulations related to China. Of course, now there is some convergence where Europe talks of China as a negotiating partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival. And the US is also talking of China, where there would be competition, there would be concentration and cooperation in certain areas. But despite policy formulation, US and European companies still remain heavily engaged in China. And according to surveys done in China, most of the US companies based in China are not pulling out of China. In fact, they are looking at enhancing their presence, enhancing their investment in China. And similarly, the same is the story related to European companies. For example, the head of Volkswagen was asked at one point about what was happening in Xinjiang, and he said he knew nothing about that. And so they are just looking at their economic engagement to going ahead. So one question that arises that if the US is not able to deal effectively with a two fronts challenge, will it try to accommodate one more than the other? And which is that front where it will be willing to show accommodation? Would it be on the front with Russia? Would it be on the front with China? And many have argued that given the linkage of US companies with the Chinese economy, perhaps there would be greater willingness to show some accommodation to China to sort of lessen somewhat the Russia-China convergence at the moment. But again, we'll have to see how that plays out. And in all this competition, I think one thing that we'll have to watch out for is what is happening in terms of the critical and emerging technologies. Artificial intelligence, quantum, cyber, 6G, space, biotech, because the developments in these areas and who leads in these areas will also influence the shape of the geopolitical competition that plays out. So these were some of the thoughts that I wanted to share further based on the comments that came in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Arun. It's very clearly emerged that things are getting very, very complicated. And today there was an editorial in Global Times, and they very clearly, taking no sides yet, Chinese. And they say it's a very complicated game and we are neither this side nor that side. It's clearly that the China is emerging as a dark horse and probably they're getting more opportunities than the challenges as the new geopolitical situation is emerging. Having said that, now let's throw the house open for question and answer session. Let's begin with the people who are digitally connected. Are there any questions from outside? Just very briefly. Just give me the crux of the question.
Yes, sir. There's a question on India has been trying to delicately balance its geo-economic and geostrategic interests between Russia and US. While Russia embraces China, what options India has in this changing foreign policy architecture?
Okay, 1 second.
The second one is from our Sri Lankan friend, Rishan De Silva. He is saying that in the original Cold War, Sri Lanka along with India were part of non-aligned movement, which was not formally aligned with or against any major power bloc. What role does the NAM and India as a founder member take in this new Cold War?
Thank you. So we'll address these questions. I'll request Ambassador Arun K to please address these questions on geopolitical options of India. That is United States vis-a-vis Russia. And the second thing is any future of NAM, and you may like to dilate on what happens to our so-called strategic autonomy and now that multi-vector engagement foreign policy. Is there a case for us to review or have a little more calibrated approach? And then we'll request other guests to speak, but if you've been dealing with it right at the very apex level, I thought I'll request you for a response.
Thank you. So I think, as was discussed also earlier, for India, it's going to be a period of great challenge because we have a very strong relationship with Russia. We have a very strong defense partnership. Nearly 60% of our defense inventory is still of Russian origin. At critical periods, Russia has been supportive of India, including in the international context. In the UN Security Council on many issues, Russia has supported India. I recall that in 1998, when we had done our nuclear tests, while Russia had been critical of what India had done, it had opposed sanctions against India. And of course, France at that time had neither criticized India and had also opposed sanctions against India. So Russia is a very important partner, and we have to keep that in mind and not place all our eggs in one basket, because ultimately every country takes decisions based on its own interests. Not to help another country as such. Now, as far as the US is concerned, it's been a growing relationship since 2000. There is broad bipartisan support in the US for the India relationship. From the time of President Clinton to Democratic Clinton, Republican George Bush, Democratic Obama, Republican Trump, Democratic Biden, the relationship step by step has only consolidated. And as I mentioned earlier, if you look at trade, investment, people to people, student relationships, US is India's strongest partner, and again has the strongest network of alliances and partnerships in the global context. And for many of India's aspirations, US support is very important. It was only because of US support that the civil nuclear agreement could be worked out, including in the international context, so that the restrictions that were there in India for getting supplies declared to related to nuclear power could be removed. And again, it was US support that enabled India to become part of many other multilateral export control regimes. So these are factors that we have to keep in mind. So I think we'll have to take positions on these issues very, very carefully, keeping in mind our interests and trying to ensure, if possible, that neither of our partners is disappointed with the positions that we take. Now, it will certainly be a challenge, but we'll have to do it.
May I just give you a follow-up things on this? Now, you see, we've seen India's response so far. In Crimea, we had supported Russia that time. Subsequently, we abstained in the UN, and in the foreign ministers' quad meeting again, our foreign minister was very evasive and he did not want to get involved in that minefield of that discussion. And now again, we're talking about peaceful and negotiations, and we've not really criticized Russia. Now, will there be some kind of a pushback from United States of America?
So my sense is that the
Sound? What's happened?
So I think what is happening is technically we are not able to unmute ourselves because that's how the system locks us out. So we need help to unmute ourselves when we are speaking. But anyway, so as I mentioned, I think at the level of policymakers in the US, there will certainly be an understanding of India's position and the compulsions under which it is operating. But there will be voices in the US who would criticize India, especially perhaps in the US Congress, the think tank community, and elsewhere, because they would argue that they have been supportive of India on many issues. They've been supportive in terms of the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement, and which helped to remove all the restrictions related to nuclear power technology, and no other country could have done that. They have been very supportive of India in the context of China. And you saw, for example, the position that the US took last year. We had the problem around the line of actual control, and including support that was then, or after the action we had taken related to Article 370 and JNK in 2019. It was France and the US who had been very supportive of India in the UN Security Council. So there would be a sense among some quarters in the US that perhaps they expect India to be more understanding of their compulsion, their position, and what they see are elements from their point of view of a rules-based order. But again, norms, we have to understand, each country argues norms based on their perspective. For example, in the West, it is now said that we do not accept spheres of influence. Now, while they say that, it is clear that in Latin America, US sees that largely to be an area under its sphere of influence. Of course, at the moment, there is Chinese ingress into Latin America, which they are comfortable about. But in terms of political strategic influence, they see that as their area of influence. Again, the US says that nations have a right to choose their own alliances. But I think US would be very concerned if countries in Latin America started entering into strategic alliances or military alliances with Russia or China. So, we have to keep that in mind, that norms and principles are defined based on how countries see their interests, and they try to push for that. But India will have to, keeping in mind our interests on both sides, will have to judge issues based on India's interests. And I think, again, we have to keep in mind that in the context of China, while we need to retain our relationship with Russia in a way to prevent Russia from going entirely over to China on India-China issues, we have to keep in mind that in the context of China, it is US which will be far more supportive of India than any of the other major powers. Thank you.
Thank you. About the second question, I'll just very brief response about this non-alignment. You see, we have graduated to a multi-vector alignment policy. Non-alignment in today's interconnected world is no more relevant. At the same time, India is also advocating the concept of concert of middle level powers and small level powers so that you do not get sandwiched in the great power rivalry. So I think that is where the future lies, and it must start with regionalism. First, the regional integration and regional cooperation must get forged before you get into the outside concentric circles to have a bigger concert of middle level powers, so that we become in our own right as a balancing factor. Are there any other questions from outside? No. Okay, role of Quad in the Cold War is one question. Yes, now question for the audience here. Just a minute. Yes, so let me start. First, take a 360-degree view. Some people get totally missed out. Yes, so yes. Please identify yourself and then ask your question.
This is Commodore Mamik. I have three odd questions. The first one is, can the Chinese absorb the excess gas coming from Russia, which is being stopped to Europe? I don't think they can. The second question is, this question is to Sri Atul, and did the entry of China into the WTO lead to this new Cold War? And also that to Mr. Christopher, that did the United States non-signature of UNCLOS lead to the Chinese excursion into the South China Sea and their lack of response to that? And the fourth question is again to Atul, that do you see Modelsky's long cycle war of 100 years long cycle war is actually relevant even today, despite his postulation in the 80s? And this comment, because World War I, 1914, and now you see rising power, the challenger, the the receding power, and exactly the contestation is along the similar lines to what Modelsky had forecast. Thank you very much.
Okay, so first I think I'll request Mr. Christopher, and rest of the question I'll direct it to you. Mr. Christopher, what role do you visualize of a Quad in the new Cold War? You are the driving force of Quad. So that's why I've thrown that question at you.
Okay, so how do I see the Quad fitting into the new Cold War? It's interesting, the previous comments about self-determination, spheres of influence, and all of that. There will be mutual points of agreement where very large and intimidating factors will find a very high degree of consensus. So let's take the American-Indian relationship within the Quad. America has been very understanding of the S-400 and the S-500 missiles that India is taking delivery of. So much so that, in fact, there are carve-outs in legislation that have been proposed. I don't know if passed, but even if not passed, there's absolutely zero appetite to go after India, because technically that's a violation. I don't remember which law. So the US recognizes that there are some issues, particularly with relation to historical ties, where we kind of look the other way, kind of agree or understand, maybe not agree. And I think the Quad, a common misconception I get is that the Quad is like a sort of NATO. Well, it's not. It is much broader in the areas of agreement and discussion. So it's not going to be like AUKUS. It's not going to be like NATO, where it's purely defensive. It will have a component that is defensive, where mutual interests align. But I think and a lot, frankly, if you look at the countries who are participants, but I think the Quad will be something even more comprehensive. But to answer your question directly, I would assume, given the interests and particularly the geographic location of most of those countries, I think there will be a lot. They will have a very important role.
Thank you. Yes. So, now our principal speaker, who's been very patient, some of these questions about Chinese capacity to absorb gap, the entry of China into WTO, US, playing a very duplicitous role vis-a-vis UNCLOS, and that has emboldened China as far as its South China thing, and this, the cyclic wars that are taking place. Would you like to?
Quite a handful. I think let's crack on with the gas question. Today, of course, suddenly if you switch the tap off to Europe and turn it to China, then China cannot obviously absorb it. But in the long run, yes, because China can simply lower its imports from Qatar and Saudi Arabia and even Iran, and increase its imports from Russia. And doesn't have gas, and it's a major economy, and it can, over time, certainly absorb much of it. Who knows all of it? The demand and supply adjust. So eventually, that's not that much of a bother. The second question, it's in the long run. In the short run, there'll be transition costs, of course. The second question about WTO. Well, 2001, same year, 9/11 WTO. A number of people I've met from the military, from politics, from academia, all sorts of walks of American life. We have Christopher here. We've had these discussions in our long walks. The 20-year distraction that occurred for America, getting bogged down in the sands of Iraq and the rocks of Afghanistan, was precisely the time when China industrialized. Industrialized big time. Factories left the Midwest. Factories left the Deep South. I've driven across America 4 times. 4 times. I've been to hollowed out small towns, shells of buildings. You ask, what is this? We used to make washing machines. We used to make toasters. America increasingly is a place of extremely high skill economy. So you certainly have Silicon Valley, but unknown to many, America is also seeing a great renaissance in a new kind of smart manufacturing. The polymer capital of the world is Akron, Ohio. Most people don't know that. Batesville, Mississippi is where you have incredible manufacturing. They're mixing both software and hardware to make intelligent stuff. Tesla is an example. It's the most shining example where of using software and hardware, but there are lots of other things that are doing so. New methods of production using new materials. So whilst all of that is true, such smart manufacturing, such new materials, such combination of software and hardware do not increase too many jobs. Often they go to PhDs who come out of IITs in institutes of technology, or Technion Israel, or Beida, Tsinghua in China. So the reality is that the multiplier effect and the trickle-down effect is not that much. And so when you drive across America, there are these towns that have a chicken processing plant in the Deep South, places which have low-skill taquerias and a gas station, and they eke day by day. They have barely $500 of cash to live by. So as an economy, certainly the 20 years have not been great for the average American. The cost of living has gone up, whether it is healthcare or childcare. And that is not reflected in inflation figures, by the way. Inflation figures are misleading, and Christopher can educate you all about it. And this sort of thing worries conscientious politicians like Christopher, who'd like to take a 5, 10, 20-year worldview. Most politicians have been too busy running elections non-stop every 2 years. So you're fundraising 60, 70% of the time, or whatever, a huge percentage of the time. But the point I'm getting at is that whilst America has become internally divided, and whilst America has seen the cost of living and standard of living, cost of living rise and standard of living fall, and employment and good jobs becoming a real issue, China has risen and risen and risen. So China's entry into the WTO was fundamental. I would argue perhaps even more important than 9/11 in the long run. 9/11 was, yes, it was a terrorist attack. Yes, it was the first attack on American soil. Pearl Harbor happened in an island far away. And yes, the psychological impact of it was tremendous, but it was a bunch of madmen doing this act. They weren't particularly capable or strategic. The war on terror was, I mean, it should have been a sideshow. It became the main show. And so America took its eye off the ball, and China did profit from it. Moving on to the next question, which is
No. See, what is that reason why US is not joining or signing UNCLOS?
well, the US has its exceptionalism, and part of it has felt Russian resentment as well. When Putin offered support after 9/11, the US just basically let the 1972 anti-ballistic missile treaty lapse. And so American exceptionalism, particularly these days, can sometimes benefit them, but sometimes it hurts them. I mean, politically, it's really hard to get anything through, even if you sign a treaty. Yeah, I mean, you signed, the Americans signed 2 climate treaties, and then the next administration said, "Thank you very much. We won't abide by them." The Iran deal, imperfect or terrible, or absolutely catastrophic, as some would call it. But the reality is, after signing the deal, the next president comes along and says, "It's over, chop chop." So America has undermined its own rules-based order, because America is doing things it did not do in the 50s and 60s. So now when someone says America stands for rules, and people say, yeah, only when they suit you. So this is a degeneration of political culture and strategic culture in America. This is what has happened to all societies, not just America. I think there's been a degeneration in political life, for instance, in the UK. Someone like Boris Johnson is no Winston Churchill, even though he may try to slouch and pout like Churchill. I mean, at the end of the day, he hasn't been a soldier. He hasn't been a spy. He hasn't been a diplomat. He hasn't had a real career. I mean, the man was a tabloid journalist, for Christ's sake. And so you have leaders like that who are populists, who undermine institutions, and that has been across the board. So, and that brings me very nicely onto the final question: that is, will there be a war after a century? And I think this is almost inevitable in democracies. We can go back to if we want to, we can go back to none other than Athens. Athens degenerated into a cesspool of vicious, competing interest groups. And mind you, it was a small democracy. And of course, they ended up in the Peloponnesian War. They had the plague. They ended up, and it was a democracy that made Socrates drink poison. He went through due process. So Athens disintegrated, Rome disintegrated. Democracies are not as inevitable and as formidable as the modern ideology trumpets it. Democracies can degenerate into identity groups, interest groups. And what is woke politics all about? At its essence, it is, I am lesbian, I'm gay, I'm bisexual, I'm transgender. And if I remember correctly, and Christopher is here, he can correct me, there was a time when US military soldiers were getting funded for transgender sex change operations, but they couldn't have a treatment in IVF fertility treatment. So and everyone, tomorrow someone will say, I'm a spotted hyena, and there are 5 of us who feel like spotted hyenas, and we need special rights and special bathrooms. And at a time when you have big challenges, the disintegration of America into such identity groups, and let's not even begin about interest groups. There are so many interest groups in America. For instance, of course, there is the insurance industry in healthcare, but then, of course, there are the doctors as well. And then, of course, there are the pharmaceutical agencies. And then, of course, there are the tort lawyers, whom hardly anyone mentions, because if you get one thing wrong, you get sued to oblivion as a doctor. So you prescribe 10 tests when you need 2, or maybe just 1. And so the disintegration of America into interest groups where everyone watches out for their own little tribe and forgets a sense of broader public good and common purpose. So this narrowing of the community, the disintegration of a broader community with public interest in mind, where foreign policy, where sort of politics stops at the shore, and this ability to look beyond your nose in a society with non-stop elections. That is a problem not just with America. With America, it's magnified because it's a superpower. It's a problem for the UK. It is a problem for the EU. It's a problem for India. It's a problem that all democracies face. And democracies, I always point out, I take a contrarian view. Democracies are young and fragile. 1789, there was a king. 1776 was the Declaration of Independence. We have an American sitting here. That war continued till 1782. Women got the vote in 1920 after World War I because the men were away at the front. Conveniently, and pay was going to women. Not just their own pay when they were working in the factories, but the pay of the men at the front. So 1920 is when women get the vote. It's just been a century. The countries such as India got independence starting 1947. Democracy is young and fragile. It's like a teenager. Democracies are exactly like the teenager who may have great potential and do great things, but can also start snorting cocaine and having whiskey. So democracies have to be tended, and they're delicate affairs. And what do they even mean? You could have voting, but people could lose interest in Russia in some ways. And I'll bring a name, Vladislav Surkin, who I think is one of the best at this game of myth making. He is perhaps even cleverer than Joseph Goebbels, and that's saying something. I mean, all the trappings of democracy exist in Russia. Do they have elections? Of course they do. Did Putin step down from power? Of course he did. Does he just send troops over like Hitler? No. First, these republics have declared independence, then there'll be a referendum, the same model as Crimea. So I'll close it at that yes, people forget what war and hardship is like. Democracies and societies decline. And precisely when they decline and you get a political elite and a bureaucratic elite that is out of touch and is unable to factor in long-term interests, and they've all shrunk to their narrow sectarian interests, and combine that with identity politics, the risk of conflict shoots sky high.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You know, this morning I was reading Russian TV news. There's been 10% drop in the financial market of Russia, and there's been phenomenal increase in the insurance cost there. But on the other hand, Russian society has tremendous resilience to cope up with adversity.
World War II, Napoleon.
Because their pride has really been hurt very badly, and they can live through this economic contraction and economic distress. So I think we are in for a long haul. Yes, Dr. Roshan. And then who else has a question? Yes, General Asthana. Okay. Quick question.
Thank you, General Sharma. Coming back to new Cold War, we know that Cold War had military as an important pillar. And when we talk about new Cold War, economy has become important. And it has not manifested as of now to the military, because China's military dominance globally is yet to be proven. Christopher rightly pointed out that economically also there are certain flaws with the Chinese where they have failed. So do you think we are overhyping this new Cold War between US and China? And what the Sri Lankan rightly pointed out, it is still in transition, because globally as of now, if we see, we have US, Europe has Russia, Asia has China, and if the middle powers like Japan, Australia, and India come out together, if they come together, so the things, there is a global flux. There's no clear-cut new Cold War as of now. Your comments, please.
Okay, Jan Asthana.
Okay, see you. I'll take it on from here. I'll give a premise and I would invite comment of Christopher. Firstly, after 1991, when USSR disintegrated, the Cold War 1.0 was supposed to have been closed, but it continued because you added another 14 countries. And when it reached Ukraine, you find that Cold War has jumped, Cold War 1.0 has jumped on your face. Second point is, at the same time, China, is assertive today. You don't control it, it becomes aggressive. You don't control it, it will become chaotic. So situation is that during Trump era, you ended up into a Cold War 2.0. All of a sudden, you found that your interdependency on China is so much that you shifted from Cold War 2.0 back to Cold War 1.0. Now, this is something wherein you have left China unguarded. I don't think US by itself has the resilience and the appetite to take on these two challenges together. So therefore, you need others as well. Now, where is the logic of boosting up Ukraine? Because today, as Christopher very correctly pointed out, you are not doing the heavy lifting on military sphere in Ukraine. You want him to fight. You are also not telling him, because their president very clearly, when he went to Munich, he was saying, please tell me, are you going to include me or you are not going to include me? Please tell me that what is your, will you put sanction today or you will put sanction when I have already, when the incursion has already started. So as of now, there is a flux in the foreign policy. You don't know who the right enemy is. Are you actually fighting the right enemy? And are you ignoring basically all your logic on Ukraine is that there is a sovereignty issue and sovereignty is being challenged. Where was the sanctions when the sovereignty issue in South China Sea was challenged? Where was the sanctions when the sovereignty issue in Himalayas was challenged? Where was the sanctions? You have never sanctioned China because you know that you are so much dependent on that. So sovereignty is selective. It's being used in the selective domain. So you know that you don't have a dependency on Russia. That's why a sanction on Russia is very convenient. My last point is, on which I want to comment, do you think only by sanctions you can remain the sole superpower? I don't think so. Because if you cannot do heavy lifting, if you cannot do, if you do not have the appetite for deployment anymore after Afghanistan, and then you think that purely by sanctions I'll be able to manage this entire world, I think there is a rethink required. Comments from Christopher.
Okay, thank you. Now, what I'll request is, let me start, response to these questions and any other final comments that our panelists would like to say. Let me start with Dr. Vignaraja, please. Do you have any response to the questions that were raised and your final comments?
Yes, yes, thank you very much. Just a couple of small responses. On this question of China joining the World Trade Organization and what impact that had, I just want to say that the main benefit was changing all the laws and regulations in China to make it very market friendly. And that was an important factor in locking in the domestic reform agenda of China. So Chinese did domestic reforms. They went to the WTO and did additional reforms in order to lock in the provisions there. And that was the factor. So there was a two-stage process. The WTO alone was not sufficient for China to emerge in the way that it has. And don't forget, China also had a huge dividend got from investing in decades of primary, tertiary, and other types of upskilling, which foreign investment was able to exploit. And that's how it became the global factory. So it's not just a simple magic bullet of the WTO membership conferring anything, but a combination of factors that came to play. Just this issue of the Cold War, yes, I think it's probably a transition issue. And I think we will see how the Ukraine crisis plays out. And what it really means for India, I think, is really this issue of neutrality tilting towards the US while trying to keep some sort of friendship with Russia. And I think it's going to be a very big struggle for India. For the smaller countries, I think we need to adhere more towards this neutrality principle if we can, while arguing for restraint, because the hot war would be damaging to the global economy as it is coming out of the COVID crisis. And it will be bumpy times for other factors, but I think this tension will be an added downer and cause misery for millions of people for some time to come unless we are careful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now, Mr. Christopher, your quick response.
Yes, sir. General, I understood there was a lady who asked a question at the beginning. Some of that I couldn't make out. And then the gentleman had a concern about sanctions. Can someone help me understand what the first question was? I kind of understand the second one, I think.
Her question was that is there a new Cold War at all? Or we are, hyping it up and it's a transitional stage that there is some kind of a confrontation. So do you subscribe to the view that this is just a state of flux, or there is already a full-blown new Cold War?
May I quickly add, General Asthana had a question for you. He said that the US was in Cold War 1.0, and now under Donald Trump, it went into Cold War 2.0 with China. And now it's reverted to Cold War 1.0. And does it have the ability and the appetite to fight? Because economic sanctions may not prove to be enough. That's the summary of his question.
So earlier we touched on the increasing U.S. reliance on sanctions. I know the SWIFT system was discussed, something I think at this point is unlikely given certain creditors outside of Russia. So I think the U.S. has been overly reliant on sanctions. I think that's one reason why we've seen China develop workarounds within the financial system to avoid those biting. I do think to discuss going from 1.0 to 2.0 and back to 1.0, of course, the Cold War with the Soviet Union was unique. But I don't think we've been quite as whiplashed as some would suggest. I think there has been a very uneasy peace with Russia. Look at the skirmish with in Georgia and Saakashvili thinking we would save him. Look at Crimea. Crimea is interesting because what happened 2 years earlier, as somebody pointed out, President Obama ignored his red line, at which point I think Putin thought, well, he's not going to do anything. And I think that's when the planning for Crimea began. So I think that they are updated for the modern world, but I don't see these extremely clear distinctions aside from the times. These are great power struggles and fights, though they are not as ideological in a way, though they are more economic. The discussion about technology is well taken. I think that's where this is going. China has said that some of their great objectives is to, be the largest producer of chips and, widgets, technological widgets. So I don't view this all as being a complete whipsaw back and forth. But I do think that the U.S. has been overly reliant on sanctions. I also want to address the question about whether or not we've sanctioned China. What is a tariff? What is a sanction? Donald Trump certainly introduced a broad variety of sanctions. China retaliated and tried to hit the farmers in America, which he knew were aligned more with Republicans. So whether or not there's been a sanction per se, there certainly have been economic consequences for various actions. So I don't think it's technically fair maybe to say we haven't sanctioned China that much, but I think we have taken the steps of introducing a lot of very strong tariffs. I also want to address a question I see over here, and I think it's a fair one. Who am I to say? The USA criticizes Russia frequently because of the military activity of Moscow on Ukraine's border with nearly 200,000 soldiers. However, there are 200,000 Chinese soldiers on the border with India, and the USA doesn't frequently criticize China to pull back those forces. The US has an obligation to NATO. So we have a vested interest not only as somebody who supplies the big sack of money, but also, we have a relationship. I mean, we are involved in a defense posture to where an attack on one is an attack on all. Whether or not we should comment more often on, Chinese aggression in India is fair. But I think the reason why the U.S. focuses more on NATO is because, one, the economic consequences that we're seeing now. It was commented, markets are declining, down 10% in Russia. It creates tremendous instability among our Western European and Eastern European partners. And we have a responsibility, a formal responsibility there. I would only close with some additional remarks, I suppose, on Chinese nationalism, which is disconcerting to me, because a nationalism that marginalizes risk or fails to recognize internal problems is posed to behave irrationally. I mean, China faces internal unease, a top-down government that's more like a cult of personality at this point, an economy increasingly built on zombie state-owned enterprises, a population decline. We've talked about wounded pride, both in terms of China and Russia, and the classic growing old before becoming rich problem. And I think a lot of actions China takes these days, we say, well, China's becoming stronger and more assertive. I'm not so sure that they're not born of insecurity. I'm not so sure Russia isn't, at least in part, in Ukraine now because they feel that it's slipping away. Polls of Ukrainians and how they perceived Putin a decade ago have completely flipped. And so I think he sees this as the last gasp and the best opportunity. China's also pretty insulated. Contrary to the past policy of what was referred to as the grasp the big, let go of the small, you see she increasingly grasps the small to the point where power is tremendously concentrated in Xi, who is often called the chairman of everything, with little outside understanding as to the rationale for the policy decisions. And I want to emphasize that misunderstanding is a lot of times what sets off these hot wars from these cold wars. Cold War 1.0, to go back to that, has lessons to offer about miscommunication and misunderstanding. So I think we need to continue to keep this dialogue going so that we understand why Xi is doing what he is, without regard to whether or not he should be there or how power is concentrated. I'll just close by saying, I think of Russia and China and the US as kind of teenagers. The US is like the morose teenager who sulks in a room all day, and Russia's the teen with cigarettes in its shoulder and a tattoo and wants a motorcycle, and China is an overly confident teen who feels the keys to the family car are a birthright. And none are clear-headed and none are very true. I do think that American values retain their cachet around the world in a way that China's have not. I mean, who wants to live in a surveillance state? But does the West have the will to defend those values? So I think that is a tremendous concern of mine. And with that, I'll close.
Thank you very much. Your concluding remarks.
Well,
anything to say?
I just have
to respond to each question.
No, I just have one thing to say. The lady said that the Cold War, the first Cold War, was military. I would say the first Cold War was everything. It was military, it was ideology, it was economics, and eventually what destroyed the Soviet Union was empty bread shelves. Blue jeans and rock and roll won because they were far more attractive than Brezhnev, who wanted to live in a surveillance state, to echo Christopher. And the Soviet Union was a surveillance state. Beria was in charge and people were getting killed left, right, center. Millions of kulaks died in the 30s. In fact, Ukrainian kulaks died in the 30s. They suffered. And there's that burning resentment in Ukraine as a result. Just as there's Russian resentment, there is Ukrainian resentment. And the Ukrainians welcomed the Nazis in World War II when they first arrived, some of them, the Western ones. Now, of course, when they realized that the Nazis thought of all Slavs as Untermensch, then they quickly turned around because the Nazis weren't exactly nice. But we must never forget that Stalin killed more people in Ukraine than Hitler. So history is a way of coming back. There is never really an end to history. And Christopher's analogy of two teenagers is right. I'll add to that just one line. I would say that we are living at a time when political systems, both in the US and Europe, as well as in Russia and China, are under tremendous internal strain. It's the pressure cooker effect. In Russia, what happens if Vladimir Putin slips in the bathroom and cracks open his skull? What happens if Xi Jinping trips over, has a concussion, and then ends up in coma like our late Foreign Minister Jaswant Singh, with whom I worked for a bit? What happens? What is the succession plan? There is a massive problem in both these authoritarian states. Power is concentrated, and they are no more immortal than Genghis Khan or the great pharaohs or you and me. We will all shuffle out of our mortal coil, to quote or paraphrase Shakespeare very poorly. That's a big problem there. Institutions have weakened. They've all become more and more, these states and societies, engineered around personality cults. So there's a huge weakness, as Christopher points out, both in Russia and China. Having said that, there's a huge internal weakness, I don't need to repeat it, in the European and American democracies. The opposite problem of centralization, fragmentation. What is it to be American today? Is it about being a consumer and going and buying the cheapest stuff of Amazon and tattooing yourself and claiming an identity? Or will the Americans fight for and die for something? They did between 1776 to 1782. The question is, what will they now? And the question is even more profound for the Europeans, because as someone said way back, the British had traded their empire for false teeth. They all have universal health care. They all have very cushy and comfortable welfare states. But then if you spend so much on welfare, you can't spend on military. And when people are just too comfortable, then they are not entrepreneurial. They are not risk takers. And they don't want to fight. And at some point, Putin comes along and says, hang on a minute, I can have that share of your pie. What are you going to do about it? And of course, there is legitimate anger, somewhat legitimate anger and grievance, because someone like Jeffrey Sachs did demolish almost single-handedly the Russian economy. Shock therapy was ghastly for the Russians. Hyperinflation, no health care, no bread. It was worse than communism. So we are living in a very complex, torturous world. And yes, I agree with our friends, our Sri Lankan friends. This is a time of flux, but this is also a time of Cold War. Because of that flux, it is also a time of great power tension. It's a time of the Thucydides trap. And if someone somewhere loses his or her rag, more likely his rag, we could descend into hot war. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you. And Ambassador Arun, would you like to give your concluding remarks, please? Okay. So finally, I just want to say that presently we are really into a zero-sum game kind of a scenario. And none of the sides are actually backing off, and everybody is trying to use this, what you call is the multi-domain warfare approach to achieve its strategic objectives. At the end of the day, I don't think this can continue the way it is. Russians definitely have certain genuine concerns as far as Carpathian Gap is concerned. That's 500 meters in Eastern Europe. Those concerns have to be allayed by Europe and United States of America. Otherwise, Russia is not going to compromise on anything. Similarly, Chinese in their own right, they feel that they need to be accommodated in the Indo-Pacific construct, and it's no more that they would be led by an American crafted world order international system. So they also want certain stakes in that. And third thing is actually America, Pax Americana has lost its sheen. And it is time for America to reinvent itself, become more competitive, become a genuine democracy and provide leadership by leading from the front in terms of, what the democratic values should be, and provide an alternate model to the world which requires development. For example, African continent, some of these East European countries, some of the European countries, they require development, and Chinese with their deep pockets and very quick decision making are filling up that vacuum. Unless the world gets an alternate model, that this competition is going to stay. So my own vision is that I think in coming one decade, this is going to play out at level that we are seeing it. There'll be ups and downs, and maybe after a decade that these great powers will probably learn to reach an inflection point of some kind of an equilibrium, and we will probably have maybe a new cycle of balance of power. Till then, I don't visualize there's going to be a hot war because the cost for everybody is extremely high. But this multi-domain warfare, we're seeing a classic case in example. I think this is the new flavor of the season, and all countries who are indulging in it, they should be prepared, particularly a country like India. I don't think today United States of America is braced for fighting in the multi-domain warfare vis-a-vis Chinese and Russians who have achieved great skills and mastery in planning and prosecuting this kind of a warfare. So with this, all it remains for me is to thank Mr. Atul, who has enlightened us with his very deep insight, and we have a relationship with fair observers. We are going to do more and more number of events with them, and other panelists from Sri Lanka, and Christopher, for him particularly, it's very awkward time to be with us because I think it's midnight there. So thanks a lot.
It's 3 a.m.
And for all the audience and those people who are digitally connected. And we look forward to more such participation in times to come. So finally, the refreshment is laid out outside. May I request